Welcome to UO Today. I'm Barbara Altmann, Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. Our guest today is Carol Stabile. Previously at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, she became Director of the UO's Center for the Study of Women in Society in September 2008. She also holds a joint appointment as a full professor in the Department of English and the School of Journalism and Communication. Carol's work is highly interdisciplinary and focused at the intersections of race, gender, and class in new and traditional media. She has taught classes on feminist theory, women's and gender studies, cultural studies, the political economy of the media, and crime news. She is the author of a book entitled White Victims, Black Villains, Gender, Race, and Crime News in U.S. Culture, 2006, and is currently writing a book on gender, race, class, and the broadcast blacklisting during the Red Scare of the 1950s. Another piece of Carol's current research examines the philosophical implications of digital gaming by focusing on gender roles and interactivity. Carol, welcome to Eugene and to the university.
Thank you, Barbara.
And thanks for coming to talk to us. First of all, I have to ask you what it was that drew you away from Milwaukee and to Eugene and CSWS.
Well, I hadn't intended on applying for jobs last year, but the ad for this particular job crossed my desk, and I thought that it was an opportunity I couldn't refuse. The opportunity actually to oversee a research center that was devoted to studying women in society. So the job itself convinced me to throw my hat in the ring, and then I came and interviewed here actually just about a year ago and was really impressed by the level of interdisciplinary activity at the University of Oregon, as well as the faculty members that I met and the staff at the center. So it was a very easy sell from that point on.
It's a pretty great fit with the dimensions of your own work, isn't it?
Right. And I think that because I don't appear to be a humanist entirely, and I don't appear to be a social scientist entirely, that I can speak to both those constituencies, and that my own work, which really is at the intersections of the humanities and the social sciences, makes me a good kind of bridge between those areas.
And you'll be welcoming of all those constituencies in the center,
Absolutely.
I'm sure.
Absolutely.
You haven't been here long, but do you already have some idea of what directions you'd like to see the center move in?
Well, yeah, though I've been here since August, so I've spent the last 3 months talking to faculty and getting a sense of what the strengths are and what are kind of the ways into the future and the ways to proceed. And I think that the academic plan also is this opportune moment to start thinking about the future of the center and the future of research on women. One of the things that I've been working on is bringing faculty together from the humanities and social sciences who are interested in new media and technology and establishing a working group around that area. But certainly there's a lot of really impressive activity already going on at the center. We have the Americas Rig, which is very, very dynamic and includes a number of faculty who work on Latin America from a broad array of disciplines.
May I interrupt you long enough just to say that RIG is a research interest group, right?
Yes.
So they're a research interest group on Latin America.
Right. And there's also the Wired Humanities Project has a long history of working with new media and technology on campus. And the new RIG, the new research interest group I'm working on, is working closely with them. And there are lots of practical things that we need to do. We're working on a website update and our communications package. So.
The changeover in directorship is always a good moment to do some taking stock and
to rethink. Yeah, I think rethink things. I think especially in universities, it's a time of change in how we communicate with our constituents as well as communicating outside the university. And the Center for the Study of Women in Society has always been very active in kind of breaking down that whatever barriers exist between the university and the community. So we're really working on our website. We're trying to move away as much as we can from a paper-based communications package in the interest of conservation and sustainability. So we've had a lot to do.
Sounds like you've had a busy few months. Would you mind if we turn to your own research? You've done so many interesting projects that I can't wait to jump in. I wanted to ask you first about your research on gender issues in multiplayer online games. Mm-hmm. And I think you have a particular interest in World of Warcraft. Mm-hmm. Is that right?
I do.
But let me ask you first. I believe I heard you say that you also play World of Warcraft, yes?
I do play World of Warcraft. In fact, I started about a year and a half ago, and I started playing the game not because I've played a lot of video games in the past, or I've been a gamer in an active sense, but because I was really interested in those persistent virtual environments and very much aware of how many people spend substantial parts of their everyday lives playing with other people, socializing in those spaces. So I came to World of Warcraft as a media scholar rather than a gamer, and I think that I've become a gamer despite myself over the last year and a half over the course of playing that game.
Could you backtrack for a quick second and tell us what you mean by a persistent virtual environment?
Well, some people might be familiar with Second Life. Second Life has gotten a lot of play in universities and in the academy in general, and that's a kind of classic persistent virtual environment. You create an avatar and you manipulate that avatar in the game space itself. What's really different from what makes Second Life so different than the massively multiplayer online games that I'm studying is that so much of Second Life is user-generated. People build their avatars from the materials that are part of the game. They build buildings, they create landscapes, they have businesses, and so on and so forth. When you're talking about online games like World of Warcraft, like EverQuest 2, like Halo, people interact in large numbers in that game, but it's a programmed environment, right? It's not as if you're creating the world itself, although I would argue that you do create the world itself as you play it in terms of how you interact with other players and in terms of the activities that you undertake while you're in that game space.
Okay, so thank you for that clarification. I appreciate that, and it does sound as though you know what you're talking about. So could you go back to the gendered aspect of this? I was really interested in a short proposal you recently wrote on this project where you were explaining that this particular game, World of Warcraft, handles gender in a way unlike other games, for example, Grand Theft Auto. Right. Could you talk about the gender differences in those kinds of games?
Well, I think that there's a stereotype of gamers as isolated teenage or young men, that these are the people who play games, these are the people who are going to be the most skilled with those technologies, the most conversant with them, and the most comfortable with them. But there's a lot of research that's suggesting that women are playing these games in larger and larger numbers. I think that's especially true of the massively multiplayer online games that I'm talking about, although there are a good number of women who also play first-person shooter games. Now, some of the games developers and designers have been more quick to respond to this audience than others.
To the young women's audience.
To women, to understanding that women are playing these games. At the level of game design, there have been a number of approaches to thinking about female audiences. One is the pink games movement. And pink games suggest that what you need to do as a game designer is create games that are stereotypically female. Right? So you might have a shopping game, or you have Webkins, or you have games that are built on relationships like The Sims. But I think what's interesting about The Sims is The Sims taught the industry something they didn't know beforehand, and that was that boys loved that game too. That game defied stereotypes about the kinds of games that young men and young women like to play. Now, the MMOs like EverQuest 2 and World of Warcraft have very consciously tried to make their games gender neutral. And what that means is that if you play as a female character, you could be a boy playing a female character, you could be a girl playing as a female character, it makes you no less powerful than any other character in the game. So gender is cosmetic in those games. It just affects your appearance, it doesn't affect your abilities. So I think for the first time in media history, girls have this experience of being a girl in which being a girl doesn't make you less powerful, and it doesn't make you vulnerable. It makes you every bit as strong and as powerful as the male figures in the games.
There's actually a line that you quote from the game manual of World of Warcraft that in fact says exactly that. The only differences between the two genders are cosmetic. So all the same capabilities, all the same vulnerabilities, and it's just a question of their external appearance that differs?
Right.
Do you know of a lot of male players who play with a female avatar?
Well, it's interesting because Nick Yee has a huge database called the Datalist Project, and the Datalist Project collects data on MMOs. It's mostly in the shape of surveys of gamers, but his data suggests that male players are much more likely to play as females in the game, while girls and women tend to almost always play their gender. So, and that's been true of the characters I've created too, in a fairly unself-reflexive way. I've always created female characters. It's just never occurred to me. Whereas I know lots of boys and men who have, a number of female avatars that they play on a regular basis. So if you're playing the game, what that means is that the female character you see in a game is more than 3 times likely to be a boy playing that female character as it is to be a girl.
More than 3 times as likely?
Yeah.
I was actually surprised by another statistic that you cited, which is that fully 94% of girls in a certain age group self-identify as online game players?
Well, 94% of girls play some kind of video game. That's the Pew study, and they use video games fairly loosely to include MMOs and to include console gaming and handheld devices and stuff like that. But what's so suggestive about that is that girls are playing almost as much as boys.
And part of your argument, if I understand the research correctly, is that counter to our stereotypes as gamers, as loners, shut up in their basement bedrooms and never interacting in any meaningful way, you actually make the argument that there are social and cultural opportunities that come with multiplayer online gaming. Did I get that right?
Yeah.
Could you explain what those social opportunities are?
Certainly. In World of Warcraft, and I'll speak about that because I know it best, there are formal associations of players called guilds. And that's one way where you see these high levels of social activity. You have to be invited to a guild, you play with players in a guild, you get to know them through guild chat. There's a lot, it's a very, very social game. You can't play World of Warcraft, you cannot succeed in a game unless you cooperate with other players. And the game's developer now boasts 7 million players internationally. I think with the greatest density in South Korea, Australia, and the United States, but also substantial numbers of players in Europe. And they spend a lot of time playing with each other, a lot of time talking with each other. There are lots of stories about families who create guilds as a way to spend time with extended families who might be separated geographically. I've met up with a couple of grandparents who play so they can hang out in a virtual space with their grandchildren. I know, and there isn't a lot of, this is also it's an interesting area for research. I don't think anyone's really working on it now, but I think it's also a space in which disabled people can socialize in ways that are really positive and really interesting. One of my former students is a World of Warcraft player, and his guild leader is a 13-year-old boy with leukemia. And the guild community has been very, very supportive through his treatment. And so all these things spill out from the persistent virtual environment into real life. And people have these affective ties, and it really does defy that stereotype of someone sitting alone in their room all by themselves, because when in reality they're connected to people all around the world.
My teenage sons have been making this argument for some time. I think they're going to be very happy that academics are publishing what they are seeing and what they're experiencing.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. And I think I've seen it as a positive social force. And I think you're really onto something.
Well, and that's one of the things I'm really interested in with girls, because I think that playing those games gives you a comfort level and a facility with the technology. that girls are still discouraged from acquiring. I mean, if we think about the kind of geek identity, it's always this kind of male identity of the computer geek who sits in his room and, writes his web pages and his wikis and stuff like that. But I think that this has been a really positive experience for girls and young women to become comfortable with the technology, to just participate in these events and in these interactions that could be really both kind of technologically and I think personally empowering.
That makes a lot of sense. I hate to turn from gaming, but I'm really eager to jump into some of the other areas of your research as well, if you don't mind. I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the recent writing you've published on the media coverage of Hurricane Katrina. I read an article that you published in fall 2007 in South Atlantic Quarterly called No Shelter from the Storm, and that was really a very insightful and quite surprising to me look at the role of race and class and gender in news reporting. Could you talk about the biases in the media that you were looking at in that piece?
Well, that piece really grew out of the research I'd done for the book on the history of crime reporting. So I remember watching the news coverage of the catastrophe in New Orleans just as I was reading the proofs of the book. And so I was really acutely aware of the history of those intersections of race and gender and class. And when I started looking at the coverage, and then later when I got transcripts of the coverage and I had the time to look at it in a more leisurely manner, it became really evident to me that these old patterns of reportage about African American communities in particular were very, very evident in the way that the news media handled that catastrophe. And African American leaders and commentators have talked about that since. So when you have fires in places like California, those disasters are covered very differently than what happened in post-Katrina New Orleans. There was this assumption that what you were dealing with was a criminalizable community, and that community became almost the authors of their own victimization through that coverage. And I think that that's what struck me the most, is that here were people who had been left homeless, who had seen friends and family die in this catastrophe, and yet they were being handled both by local institutions and the press as if they were criminals and not victims.
So if we think about the recent coverage of the fires in the Los Angeles area, for example, the media coverage that we're getting of that shows us mansions in the hills in flames and casts it as a real disaster. What, in contrast, do you remember seeing about the Katrina coverage?
Well, I mean, the first and most obvious difference is that we're talking about poor people, and poor people so seldom appear in the news media. I think what was so interesting for me about Katrina was that there were many journalists who were living in New Orleans at the time and who were really actively refusing the news frame that was being imposed by CNN and by Fox News, who were saying, no, wait a minute, these people aren't shooting, right? These people aren't criminals. These people are suffering. They need government assistance. So it was an interesting moment in seeing that kind of contrast between the journalists who were covering the story in the field and who are identifying with the people that they were covering, and then national news outlets that were really trying to kind of turn the story into something else, to make it a story not about the government's failure to take care of poor African Americans, but to talk about the poor African Americans as being criminals and therefore not worthy victims.
You're pretty severe about the television coverage. The last line of that article is, in part, television news lacked either the audacity or the courage to confront the evidence of racism that surrounded it. Have you had any backlash, any reaction from media sources on that piece?
No, I don't think that piece is particularly controversial, because I think, again, the journalists themselves were making that critique, and that's what made it such a unique situation, that the journalists were saying, and these were often white journalists, they were saying this was about race. The coverage was racist. So no, I don't think that there was much of a backlash. And you know, I mean, some people I think thought it would open up this larger conversation about race and class and poverty in the United States. It simply didn't. So it was interesting how fast that story went away.
It seems as though
Yeah.
that's a lost opportunity. You quote someone who, in fact, from the major networks who says this is an opportunity to have exactly that conversation, but then it went away when the disaster came off our screens, right?
And it'll be interesting to see what happens in the coming years as the news media has to cover the effects of the economic crisis right now. Because I think, you know, historically, poor people don't make good TV.
One of your incidents in that article was really revealing to me, and it's all about how how one's understanding of a situation changes radically if you just change the focus a little bit. So it was an incident where a woman had seen two young black men leaving a Rite Aid store with bags of merchandise and assumed that they were looting, but then discovered that they were dispensing power bars and Gatorade and medical supplies to the elderly and the wounded, and completely shifted her understanding of that first image.
Well, and there was also a bit of an online dust-up around the time. Yahoo News had published two pictures of people wading through the floodwaters, and one was a white couple, and the caption read, you know, refugees flee from the storm and they're carrying groceries. And the other was an African-American youth, and the word that they used was looting. And so a lot of people, and this is one of the interesting things about online media, a lot of people wrote to Yahoo and said, well, what's the difference in these pictures, right? They both are taking stuff. They both have, you know, they both have water, for example. You know, what makes one of them looting and one of them simply trying to survive?
You just said you were going to be interested to see how the media covers the economic hardships that are just beginning to set in as a result of the economic meltdown. Do you think that the media has changed its approach any as a result of the Katrina debacle?
I don't think so. It's funny, we were talking earlier about how the media is in a moment of reorganization and change, at least partly because it seems that President-elect Obama is going to bypass some of the traditional news media outlets in getting information out. So I think we'll have to wait and see. I don't think that all of it is driven by who's president. A lot of it, so much of it has to do with news organizations and news and the routines that they're invested in. And it may be that part of the shakeup has to do with the changing nature of journalism, and that some of those old routines, you know, are just going to have to go away because the new media environment doesn't support them. So we'll see.
You're referring, I assume, to the fact that Obama gave his first big what can we still call it, a press conference? Is that what it was, on YouTube rather than on TV?
Right. Well, and he's also making plans to have a website that'll help communicate with people. And throughout his campaign, he's used new media in very interesting ways. So, you know, and I think that Beltway journalists are, you know, really kind of sitting back and thinking about, you know, how this is going to affect them, because they've always been the gatekeepers and the arbiters of power.
We only have a few minutes left, but I want to touch very briefly on the work that you're doing now to do with women in the media. And I mentioned in our introduction that you are actively engaged in a project to do with the Red Scare and the purge of television figures at that time, and specifically on the effect that had on the lives and careers of women writers. Could you give us a brief synopsis of that project before we have to close?
Sure. Quickly, I've been writing about women who were blacklisted in the television industry in the early 1950s. And when I began the project, I was very surprised to find that there were so many women who were writing for television in particular, and that there was a fairly diverse group of women who were progressive in their politics. Some of them were African American, some of them were Jewish, some of them were communists, some of them weren't. And they were writing all these really interesting screenplays and narratives and things that featured diversity, that featured immigrant families, that featured people of color in roles that weren't demeaning or degrading. And So I became interested in them because of the silencing of those voices after 1950, because what the blacklist meant, and the blacklist disproportionately affected women in the television industry. What that meant is that they could no longer get jobs. So these were women who were effectively silenced. Some of them were quite successful. Gertrude Berg, who wrote, acted in, and produced the Goldbergs for 25 years, was graylisted. Shirley Graham, who is an African-American writer and composer, was blacklisted and actually left the country. Some of them wound up going underground and writing under front names. And it's strange because a lot of them wound up writing for children's programming. And I spent the last week reading a lot of scripts for Lassie, of all things. And Lassie had, I mean, a number of these writers went on to write for Lassie and for Daktari and Flipper. So you find these really interesting stories about conservation, about anti-racism in Lassie, right, which was the only place that people could work, I think in part because no one's paying attention to the content of Lassie. So if you said something like, there's one line where Timmy calls Lassie a reactionary, because she's being politically reactionary. Now, the sponsors weren't paying that much attention, so you could get away with having kind of progressive politics in children's shows and in other places. You certainly couldn't write ever again for primetime programming. So it's kind of an old-fashioned recuperative project. You know, here were these women, we've forgotten them in part because of the blacklist, but it's really important for us to think about that history and to think about the price we paid for silencing those kinds of voices.
What form do you anticipate your findings on this project are going to take? Is this another book?
This will be a book. This is a book project that I plan to write next year.
Oh, next year.
Yeah, I'm already writing parts of it. And probably an essay that's just on Red Lassie.
Red Lassie is
Yeah.
a
That would
great
be the title of it.
topic. Many of us will be reading that with great interest. Beyond that one, in just a sentence, do you have other projects on the horizon?
No, I think that the MMO, the massively multiplayer online game project, is probably going to take me into the foreseeable future. And who knows what that'll turn into.
We will be watching with interest on all of those, and I hope you'll come back and tell us where it leads you.
Thank you, and thanks for having me.
It's really nice of you to come. We have had with us today Carol Stabile, the director of the Center of the Study of Women's Society at the University of Oregon. Thank you for watching.